What's up, everybody? Welcome back to class. Hope you had a good weekend and enjoyed the cool down in the weather. Today, doing a couple different things. We're going to start a mini, biographical kind of series of lectures that I'm going to do over somebody who's one of my personal heroes. Not that he was all good. I don't know that you could put this guy in the total good guy or bad guy column, but he's a pretty epic figure in American history. Teddy Roosevelt. He was a president a little over 100 years ago. The other lecture I'm doing today, we'll start getting into him, and you should have your history notes out. I'll explain that in more detail when you start that video up. For this video, though, this is what would actually impact your grade today, and I'm going to tie these two documents that I'm also attaching to the lesson to today's posting, and it's going to tie into your journal number 4 writing. Okay, so get those history journals back out on. You should have all of your journals on one Google Doc where you keep a tally. Right now, if you've been caught up with everything and have been staying on top of it, we should have 3 journal writings up to this point. Today will be the 4th journal writing. We're going to have 2 parts to this journal. So you're going to write on 2 different things. First up, we talked about, let me minimize my face here a little bit so you can see what I'm displaying on my screen better. Last week, we started getting into it, the progressive era notes, what reforms were. That reforms are like changes that typically you think of are changes for the positive, for the good, where you're reforming things in society, changing government policies or laws. A lot of reforms happening today. We live in a time of upheaval. Well, that was very much true in the progressive era, too. From 1890 to 1920, a lot of new reforms, changes, some constitutional amendments all went through that profoundly impacted life in America. So we talked last week a little bit in the progressive notes about the book The Jungle, and I read you a 1-page excerpt there where that muckraker journalist, Upton Sinclair, he was a socialist that was trying to get governmental changes, but then he wrote a novel in the context of gross, horrific conditions in the meatpacking plants, and that really got people fired up, and it led to a law getting passed about 6 months after his book came out. So that's a good example of a progressive reform, the Meat Inspection Act getting passed right after Upton Sinclair published his book and got it out there, and American people started reading it. Now, the sheet that you see on my screen right now, it goes through, these are not all the laws that were passed in America from 1890 to 1920, but it gives you a good list, and they're all kind of chronological on there, where it gives some of the biggest laws that got passed, some of the most impactful ones. This is a good little cheat sheet for our semester 1 exam and potentially for quizzes coming up. So, it'll always be saved on my Google Classroom posting. You can always go back and reference it. But you might want to jot down a few of the highlights on this and put it into your history notes. That's up to you. Or if you have access to a printer, this might be a good sheet to just run one copy of it. It's a 1-page thing and throw it into your history notes, because I can tell you there's at least 3 exam questions that'll tie into different laws that are on this page here. Now, to make sense of it, the ranking thing, that's something I would normally use in class, where I would have we would, as a class activity, rank them all out and then do some discussion on it. This year, I'm going to run it a little bit different because of everything being remote and virtual learning. But this sheet's still fairly important for you. If you go through and look in the left-hand column where there's writing in it, all right, where my cursor's at right now, it tells you the name of the law and the year it was passed or enacted. Then the column on the right gives you a really quick, 1-sentence sum up of what the law actually did. So it helps you kind of make sense of each of the laws, or some of them it's like the 16th Amendment. And then in the right column, it tells you what did the 16th Amendment do. For this one, how it'll tie into our journal today. First off, I would say read through the list. Just look it over. That should take you less than 5 minutes to go over and just kind of check it out, give it a quick scan. Then I want you to go through and kind of rank them out. And you don't have to rank them 1 to 14 this time, but I do want you to give me whichever laws that you think are the most important to you personally. And you look at them, for example, the Meat Inspection Act, the one that tied into the Upton Sinclair book, where those plants were gross and horrific, and they were grinding up rats and rat poop and all that into the sausage and the hamburger. That's gross. And guess what? I like eating meat. I buy hamburger from the store. I don't want rat poop and rat fur and arsenic all ground up into my hamburger. So I'm glad that law got passed. I would rank that probably as a pretty high important one for me. But there's some others on there that I think are equally and debatably even more important, for Americans back then and today. So I want you to go through and rank out your top 3. Look over that list, and in your journal, for part 1 of the journal, it's going to be give me of the progressive era legislation handout. All right. Give me your top 3 most important laws that you're glad got enacted and are on the books. So that's pretty easy. It's opinion-based. You look it over, you pick your top 3 most important ones, and you're going to list those out for me in part 1 of the journal. And then you're going to explain why each of those 3 laws you find important, why it's personally important to you. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions about it, by all means, give me a holler, shoot me an email, and I'll try to clarify it for you. Also, I will have the instructions I just gave you, like kind of a brief summation of them. They'll be in my notes for today's lesson on Google Classroom. The other sheet, all right, I'm going to attach this too. Now, this one, you don't have to really put any of this in your notes, but I think it's some pretty interesting stuff. I'll attach it to you. So this is a fact sheet that would go to 1908. All right, kind of the time period we're talking about. That was the end of Teddy Roosevelt's second term as president. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Roosevelt and his presidency and how he impacted the country, really starting today with the other video. This sheet, just stay tuned in here for a second because this is going to be part 2 of your journal today. I'm going to read it off to you. I have a print copy right here, but you can definitely follow along and look at it. Bring this attachment up if you're more of a visual learner and you want to see what I'm going through and reading. Anyway, let me read this fact sheet off to you, and then I'll explain what you're going to do with part 2 of the journal today. So, facts for how different the world was and society was in our country a little over 100 years ago, 112 years ago to be exact. All right, first up, the average life expectancy was 47 years. Today, it's up in like the 70s. So that's average life expectancy. So most of us weren't living as long back in that era. Only 14% of homes had a bathtub. Think about that. Stinky people walking around. Only 8% of homes had a telephone. That was pretty new technology. There were only 8,000 cars and 144 miles of paved roads in 1908. Now, that's right at the beginning of like Ford Motor Company taking off and the democratization of the automobile. So that changes pretty rapidly after 1908, where more and more Americans start buying cars and getting the Model Ts after Henry Ford was found a way to make them much cheaper. The maximum speed limit in most cities was 10 miles per hour. The tallest structure in the world was the Eiffel Tower in Paris that had been built for the World's Fair. Now, it's still around. It's still pretty tall today. I was over there about 15 years ago and actually went up to the top of it. But today in most major cities, there are skyscrapers that would just dwarf the Eiffel Tower. The average wage in 1908 was 22 cents an hour. So think about that. Now, stuff was cheaper to buy back then, but that puts it in perspective. Like think of Ford Motor Company a couple years after this did that $5 a day wage. $5 a day was pretty good money when the average person's making 22 cents an hour. So $5 a day on an 8-hour shift, you were making good loot at the time. The average worker in America made between $200 to $400 a year. If you worked for Ford, you were making more than that. A competent accountant could expect to earn $2,000 a year. A dentist, about $2,500. Veterinarians, depending on where you were and how big your practice was, about $1,500 to $4,000 a year. And a mechanical engineer, those are the guys that are actually working on like the equipment and like tooling machines at like Ford Motor Company or other factories. They made about $5,000 per year. More than 95% of all births took place at home. For example, my Grandpa Taluki, he was a World War II veteran, passed away about 10 years ago. I'll share some of his stories. But anyway, he was born, if you know where the Taluki Farm Market is over by Ives, he was born right in the kitchen there. That was pretty normal. Most people were just born in their houses back then, not at a hospital. 90% of all doctors had no college education. Instead, they attended these so-called medical schools, many of which were condemned in the press, and government is very substandard. So it didn't get the kind of training medical professionals would get today, not even close. Here's some other cost things that would put in the wage question into perspective for you. Sugar cost about 4 cents a pound. Eggs were 14 cents a dozen. Coffee was 15 cents a pound. Check this one out. I like this little stat or a little fact. Most women only wash their hair about once a month, and they use borax and egg yolks for shampoo. So store-bought soaps and shampoos were very expensive. Only the wealthy people could afford them back then. They weren't mass-produced in the same way they are today. Borax, we had talked about before, came up in the Upton Sinclair book, where they would put that on the old meat that was all like nasty and had furry bacteria and fungus growing on it. Borax is like a disinfectant. You can still get it at Meijer's today and use it as like a laundry detergent. So that was what was available to common people. And then they would use egg yolks as like their moisturizer. But I remember both of my grandpas telling me that had grown up kind of in this era, that you didn't take baths all the time. You didn't shower every day. Like nobody did that. My grandpa said he'd go through the winter and just about once a month they would take a wash rag and kind of, wash their armpits out and clean up a little bit, or maybe once a week right before church or something. But you just weren't taking baths. Most people didn't have the running water. So think about that, girls, washing your hair once a month. Next up, moving on. Canada passed a law that prohibited poor people from entering their country for any reason. The 5 leading causes of death in America were, well, I'll start at the bottom and work up. Number 5 was stroke. That still kills quite a few people today. That's a blood vessel like bursting in your brain. Number 4 is heart disease, so having a heart attack. That's still a pretty big one today. The top 3, though, are far different. Number 3 leading cause of death in America was diarrhea, where you'd get an infection in your belly. You would start pooping a lot. You couldn't stop. They didn't have like the antibiotics and the treatments back then that would fix you up. So like people that suffer from diarrhea and they can't get rid of it, they have a parasite in their gut. It'll get you really dehydrated and you can't keep nutrition in your body. So diarrhea, rough way to go out on the toilet. Number 2, which has pretty much been eradicated in the United States today, is tuberculosis. It was also called consumption. In the book The Jungle, when I read you that page excerpt, they talked about the workers spitting consumption germs all over. That meant tuberculosis, where that was a long kind of drawn out death. If you got tuberculosis back then, no treatment for you really. You would cough, your lungs would get filled with phlegm, and it was really a pretty horrible way to die. For most people, it takes 10 years for it to actually get you. But you keep coughing more and more, and in the last stages, you're coughing up blood, and you're pasty and sweaty, and rough way to go out. And then number 1, and this is one you should be pretty familiar with, was pneumonia or the flu. Like people would get a bad case of the flu, their immune system's compromised, they didn't have a Z-Pack to go get, or Tamiflu or anything like that. So if your immune system was compromised, you'd get the flu, and that would develop into pneumonia, and that would take a lot of people out. Number 1 killer back then. The American flag had 45 stars. Obviously, today we have 50, so 45 states in 1908. The population of Las Vegas, Nevada, big city today, back then it was 30. So that's before the casinos started hitting, and that became a kind of a desert paradise. Crossword puzzles, canned beer, and iced tea hadn't been invented yet. There was no Mother's Day or Father's Day, so kind of Hallmark holidays, but those weren't around yet. 2 out of every 10 adults couldn't read or write. So illiteracy was much higher back then. Like both of my grandpas, both pretty smart guys that were successful people. I think one of my grandpas had formal education up to 8th grade. The other went to about 5th or 6th. And then, back in that time, there wasn't child labor laws like there is today. So it was expected you were going to go work on the farm, or you were going to get a job and help support the family. Most people didn't get a high school education back at that time. That was not the norm. Usually you'd get a grammar school elementary education if your parents could afford to have you do that. And then that was about it. Check out this stat. Marijuana, heroin, and morphine were all available over the counter at your local corner drugstores. So none of those were illegal yet. They weren't like, there was no war on drugs playing out in the country or anything like that. You could go buy all those substances without a prescription at your local, a little pharmacist store. And then some pharmacists would say heroin clears the complexion, gives buoyancy to the mind, it regulates the stomach and bowels. So side note, heroin and any opioids, they typically constipate you. So if you were one of those people that had bad diarrhea, they would often use heroin as like something to kind of bind you up and stop that. It was a treatment. And they'd say heroin, in fact, is a perfect guardian of good health. Crazy stuff, huh? Like today we look at that as such a big problem, but back then it was a little bit different. People weren't injecting it with syringes or doing anything quite like that with it, but they would mix it into drinks and stuff. Coca-Cola, it got its name because it was produced with the coca leaf. So it would have trace amounts of cocaine in it. Marijuana was not a big street drug yet. It was actually pretty uncommon. So most people weren't smoking it. But anyway, I always thought that was pretty interesting that all of those things a little over 100 years ago were like totally legal at the time. Flipping over onto the backside now, or page 2. 18% of households had at least one full-time servant. So you had a situation back at this time where there wasn't as much of a middle class. There were the poor commoners, and then there was a more elite, like kind of wealthy group. But the middle class hadn't really boomed in the way it does in World War II and later. There were 230 reported murders in the entire United States. To put that in perspective with today, now obviously the country is 3 times the population that it was 100 years ago. But still, going from a country of about 100 million people to today, we have a little over about 340 million. Anyway, 230 reported murders back then. Today, I think it's about 10 to 15,000 murders that happen on average in the United States. Now, 230 reported murders, does that mean only 230 murders happened? No, that's how many got reported and were investigated. So I would guess that there were a lot more murders actually happened back then. They just didn't come up on the radar of the police and didn't get investigated the same way. Actually, if you look at other stats, they say actually today is you are safer today than you would have been at any other point really in history. You're less likely to get murdered by another human being like in America, in a first world country today, than at any other point in history. Although if you're watching the news a lot, you wouldn't necessarily think that probably. So anyway, wrapping this one up, think of how different the world is 100 years ago to today. What's it going to be like 100 years from now? I think that's fun to look forward and, get into all that stuff. Now, hopefully you watched this through right to the very end. Part 2 of your journal, which I will also recap in the notes, I want you to tell me, just give me some reaction to that stat sheet. Tell me which of those things, if you had lived back then, and pick a couple if you want, which would you struggle with the most? Like if I had a time machine and took you out of 2020 Michigan today and put you back into 2020 Michigan of 1908, which of those things would be the hardest for you to adjust to? Or just you can give me any other thoughts about it. If any of those stats or those little factoids blew your mind, part 2 of the journal is where you can kind of free write on that. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed going over those with me. Oh, here's my button. I'm going to end this one. Make sure you do tune into the other video I'm posting today, which is going to be the beginning of a kind of a lecture series on Teddy Roosevelt. And for that one, you definitely would want to have your notes out because I'll give you a few things that'll be some exam questions. Okay, see ya.